Rain drummed against the windows of Second Cup, a steady rhythm that filled the quiet space. The scent of coffee and damp pavement hung in the air, wrapping the small cafe in a fragile calm. Serena Bennett stood behind the counter, wiping down the same surface for the third time that morning. The bell above the door hadn't chimed once. Bills piled up in a folder near the register, half hidden beneath a faded postcard from Rome. Her reflection in the espresso machine looked tired, hair hastily tied back, apron stained with old coffee splashes, eyes too old for 32. Outside, Boston's early rain blurred the streets into watercolor. She glanced at the "Help Wanted" sign taped to the window, the ink bleeding slightly from the moisture that crept through the glass. Then the bell chimed, a gust of cold air swept in, followed by a man, tall, shoulders hunched beneath a soaked, worn-out jacket. His hair clung to his forehead. His boots left puddles on the wooden floor. He hesitated near the entrance, voice rough and uncertain. "Are you still hiring?" Serena blinked. The morning haze in her mind scattered like steam. "For what position?"
"Dishwasher. I can start right away." He spoke quietly without looking at her.
His hands were red from the cold, his knuckles scraped. There was something in his voice, steady but exhausted. Serena studied him for a moment. The cafe had gone silent again, save for the rain. Mia, her barista, shot her a skeptical glance from the espresso machine. "No references?" Mia asked, arms crossed. The man, Felix, as he would later introduce himself, shook his head. "No, but I can work hard." Serena hesitated. Every instinct told her to say no. She'd hired enough wanderers, students, and drifters to know how quickly they vanished when things got hard. But there was something about his eyes, steady, restrained, almost proud despite the circumstances. She nodded. "You can start by washing the cups," Mia muttered under her breath, but said nothing else. Serena handed him a towel and pointed to the small sink behind the counter. As he rolled up his sleeves, his hands trembled slightly from the cold. Serena turned away to refill the pastry case, pretending not to notice. Outside, the rain fell harder, beating against the awning with relentless rhythm. For a while, the only sounds were the clink of ceramic and the hum of the espresso machine. Felix worked in silence, methodical and precise. He rinsed, wiped, stacked, never wasting a motion. There was a strange elegance in how he handled even the chipped cups. After half an hour, Serena brought him a mug of hot coffee.
"Here, on the house." He accepted it with a small nod.
"Thank you." She noticed the way he held the cup, careful, almost reverent, like it was something more than caffeine in a mug. "You from around here?" she asked. He shook his head. "Just passing through." There it was again, that pause before every answer, the weight of unspoken things. Serena wanted to ask more, but the morning rush interrupted. A handful of drenched regulars wandered in for their caffeine fix, and soon she was back behind the counter, multitasking orders with practiced efficiency. Felix moved quietly in the background, clearing tables, wiping spills, taking trays from customers without being asked. He didn't smile much, but there was a calmness about him, something that steadied the room. When the last customer left, Serena finally exhaled. She turned to find Felix sweeping near the door. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I don't mind." The way he said it, soft but resolute, made her pause. Through the fogged window, the city shimmered beneath the rain. Serena looked around her cafe, the mismatched chairs, the faint hum of old jazz from the radio, the crooked shelf lined with plants she never remembered to water. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And somehow the stranger standing in her doorway didn't feel like a threat to that peace. "All right," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You can stay for the afternoon shift. We'll see how it goes." Felix gave a single nod and returned to the sink. Serena watched him for a moment, then turned back to the register, unaware that this moment, this quiet decision, made in the middle of a rainy morning, would change everything. The storm outside softened into drizzle, sunlight fighting its way through grey clouds. Felix stood near the window, rinsing the last of the cups, his reflection framed by the faint glow of the streetlights. And, for the first time that day, Serena smiled, not because things were suddenly better, but because, somehow, they no longer felt quite so hopeless. Before second cup, there was Maison Verne. It was one of those places that lived in whispers and waiting lists, a cathedral of fine dining where every plate told a story and every movement. Behind the counter was choreographed perfection, and at its heart stood Serena Hale, Boston's quiet culinary prodigy. At 28, she had what most chefs twice her age still chased: a Michelin nomination, a loyal clientele, and the kind of creative instinct that turned food into emotion. Her signature dish, a truffle risotto with lemon-infused cream, had been featured in the New York Times as an ode to balance. Her kitchen was her sanctuary, the only place where the noise in her head softened into rhythm. And then there was Ethan Ward. He joined Maison Verne 2 years earlier. Sharp,
ambitious, with a smile that disarmed even the harshest critics.
to everyone else, they were the restaurant's golden pair, the visionary and her right hand. But behind closed doors, Serena and Ethan shared something quieter. Late nights in the test kitchen, sharing burnt sugar and laughter, dreams whispered over simmering pots. They planned to open a place of their own one day, a cozy corner bistro where every dish told their story. Serena believed in him, in them. She believed that loyalty and love could coexist with ambition, but ambition has a cruel way of choosing sides. It began subtly, Ethan staying late after she left, private calls she never overheard. Then one night, Serena found her notebook missing. The leather-bound journal, filled with sketches, recipes, tasting notes, and revisions from years of trial, was gone. The next morning, Maison Verne announced a new limited tasting menu for investors, featuring dishes she hadn't yet debuted. Her dishes. When she confronted Ethan, her voice trembled more from disbelief than anger.
You took my recipes.
He didn't flinch. His expression was calm, rehearsed. I presented them. For us. For the restaurant. For us? She laughed. A broken, bitter sound. You mean for yourself?
You sold them, didn't you?
He sighed, leaning against the counter. It's just business, Serena.
You're too emotional about this. Emotional?
She whispered. You stole from me. I improved your work, he replied coolly. You should be thanking me. Her world cracked open in that moment. Every late night, every touch, every whispered promise, all of it turned to ash. Within days, whispers spread. Investors pulled their support, convinced she'd been lying about her own creations. Maison Verne distanced itself from her entirely. Her name, once synonymous with refinement, became tabloid fodder. The plagiarist chef of Boston, Ethan, meanwhile was promoted. By the time the storm passed, Serena had nothing left, no reputation, no savings, no faith in the city that once adored her. She packed her knives into a worn canvas bag and left. For months, she wandered from one temp job to another, cooking in diners, catering weddings, scrubbing dishes in small-town bistros. But no matter where she went, people recognized her face, or worse, her name. The shame followed her like smoke. Until one winter evening, while passing through a quiet neighborhood on the edge of Boston, she noticed an abandoned cafe on the corner. The windows were dusty, the paint cracked, the sign hanging crooked. Second cup, it had once said. There was something about it. The forgotten charm. The faint smell of roasted beans and rainwater that made her stop. She stood there for a long time, thinking of how many second chances people never got. A month later, she signed the lease. The place was a wreck, leaking pipes, chipped tiles, and a coffee machine that coughed more than it brewed. But Serena didn't care. She scrubbed floors until her hands bled, painted the walls herself, and replaced the broken lights with warm, amber bulbs. She sold her last piece of jewelry to buy used tables and second-hand cups from a thrift shop. She wanted it to feel like home, not the grand, intimidating kind, but the kind you stumbled into when you needed to breathe. When she finally reopened the doors, only 2 customers showed up on the first day. A man with trembling hands who asked if she needed help cleaning tables, and a young woman carrying everything she owned in a plastic bag. Serena hired them both. From there, Second Cup grew slowly, quietly. The kind of place where regulars came not for perfection, but for warmth. A single mother found work behind the counter, baking muffins between school runs. A college dropout who loved the smell of cinnamon began managing inventory. Even a man who'd just been released from prison started learning how to make espresso under Serena's patient guidance. They weren't polished.
Neither was she.
But somehow, it worked. Every morning, as sunlight filtered through the front windows, Serena would open the shop early, turn on the radio, and breathe in the first roast of the day. There was something grounding in the ritual, measuring beans, steaming milk, arranging pastries on the counter. For the first time in years, her world felt small enough to manage, peaceful even. Sometimes, when customers asked if she'd ever been a chef, she would smile faintly and say, something like that. No one recognized her anymore. The once famous Serena Hale had quietly vanished, and she preferred it that way, but fate has a way of finding those who try hardest to disappear. Because one rainy evening, just as she was locking up, the bell above the door chimed. A man stood there, drenched from head to toe, a paper cup trembling in his hands. His eyes were tired, haunted. "Are you still open?" he asked softly. And though Serena didn't know it yet, that question would change everything she thought she had rebuilt. At first, Felix seemed like any other drifter who'd stumbled into Second Cup. He showed up the next morning. Same worn jacket, same quiet eyes, holding a small notebook and asking almost shyly, "Do you still need help?" Serena hesitated. He didn't have a resume, didn't ask about pay, and his voice carried the kind of exhaustion she recognized too well, the kind that came from running away from something. Still, something in his calm, deliberate tone made her nod. "All right," she said, handing him an apron. "Start with wiping tables," he didn't complain. Didn't speak much either. But as the hours passed, Serena noticed things. How he folded the cleaning cloth twice before using it. How he arranged sugar jars so the labels faced the same way. How he made space for people without ever intruding. By noon, he had memorized the menu. By the end of the day, he'd fixed the back door hinge that had squeaked for months. "Guess I'll keep you around," Serena said lightly, as she handed him his first paycheck. Barely enough for dinner, but he smiled like it was more than he expected. Over the next few weeks, Second Cup began to change, subtly, but unmistakably. It started with the lighting. Felix came in early one morning, hours before opening, and climbed up a stool to adjust the bulbs above the counter. Serena found him there, sleeves rolled up, eyes narrowed in concentration. "Those were fine," she said, half curious, half amused. He looked down, that soft half smile on his face.
Too bright for mornings.
"Coffee tastes better in softer light," she laughed.
"Oh, is that proven science or personal philosophy?" "Something like that," he murmured, twisting one last bulb.
When he stepped down, the room felt different, warmer, calmer, almost intimate. Then came the pastries. One afternoon, Serena caught him watching a customer eat.
Not in a rude way, more like someone studying a painting. "What are you doing?"
she asked. "Just noticing," he said. "People leave the last bite of your lemon tart. Maybe they're full. Maybe it's too sharp at the end," he said quietly. If you add a bit more cream, they'll finish it. Serena wanted to protest. It was her recipe after all. But curiosity won. She tried his suggestion the next day. By noon, the tarts sold out. She didn't admit it aloud, but she started trusting his instincts, and Felix never bragged.
He never said I told you so.
He just smiled when she realized he was right. That same small smile that always stopped short of reaching his eyes. Soon, the adjustments multiplied. The way he rearranged tables so that light hit each one just right. The way he placed a vase of fresh flowers near the window where people like to sit alone. He even recalibrated the music playlist, trading upbeat jazz for soft acoustic during late afternoons. Why? Serena asked one day, catching him lowering the volume again. People stay longer when they feel unseen, he said simply.
It's not the coffee that keeps them.
It's the quiet. Something in his voice made her pause. There was understanding there, not from observation, but from experience. Like someone who had lived in silence long enough to know its weight. The regulars started noticing too. The cafe felt different now, cozier, calmer, more alive. Customers lingered longer, talking softly over refilled cups. Even the air smelled different, like comfort baked into cinnamon and roasted beans. Serena found herself relying on Felix more than she meant to. He never spoke about his past, never shared where he came from or what he did before. When she asked casually once, "So, did you work in another cafe before this?" he just smiled and said, "Something like that." The way he said it made her wonder if he was telling the truth or just deflecting. His hands were too steady, too precise. He had the quiet confidence of someone who once commanded much more than a coffee grinder. Sometimes, when she caught him staring out the window between shifts, there was a flicker of something, a heaviness in his gaze, as if he was remembering a life he no longer wanted. But he always turned back to work before she could ask. One particularly cold morning, Serena arrived early to find him already there. The espresso machine hissed softly, steam curling into the dim light. 2 mugs sat on the counter, hers and his. "I figured you'd need this," he said. She smiled, taking the cup. "I should start paying you extra for showing up before I do." He shook his head. "You already pay me enough." They stood there for a moment, sipping coffee in companionable silence. Outside, the city was just waking up, taxis humming, windows lighting one by one. Inside Second Cup, it was warm and still. Serena glanced at him over her mug. "You know, you're not like most of the people who come here looking for work." He looked up, eyebrows raised slightly.
No, you pay attention.
"You care about the little things. Most people don't." A faint smile curved his lips. "The little things are what people remember." She didn't respond. But the words stayed with her long after he went back to rearranging the counter. That morning, when the first regulars came in, Serena noticed something new. A faint warmth between them, an unspoken rhythm that filled the quiet moments. When she handed him a towel or he passed her a cup, their fingers brushed just briefly, enough to make her heartbeat skip before either of them looked away. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something subtler, the quiet trust of 2 people rebuilding from ruin, learning how to exist again in the soft light of a new beginning. Every morning after that, they brewed the first pot together. Steam rising, sunlight spilling across the counter, their laughter faint but real. And somehow, Second Cup no longer felt like a place for broken people. It felt like home. The mornings at Second Cup had started to hum again, not with the noise of the city, but with life. Conversations, laughter, the kind of warmth that Serena once feared she'd lost for good. It all began with small changes, the kind Felix always made quietly. As if afraid to take credit for them, he started keeping notes. Not random scribbles, but organized columns of numbers and symbols that looked strangely professional. Every night after closing, he would sit at the corner table, pen in hand, tracking orders, inventory, and daily traffic. At first, Serena thought it was just his way of passing time, until one evening he handed her a notebook. "I've been looking at your supplier costs," he said matter-of-factly. "You're paying almost 15% more than the average for your milk and beans." Serena blinked. "Excuse me?" He flipped open the notebook, showing her neat handwriting, line after line of data, phone numbers, and comparisons. "If you switch to Baxter Dairy," he continued, "you can save a few hundred a month. And if you negotiate a fixed-rate contract with your distributor, you'll stabilize your profit margin." She stared at him like he'd just spoken another language. "How do you even know this?" He shrugged, eyes downcast.
"I used to handle supplies for another place."
"Big orders, big?" She pressed. His lips curved into that familiar, evasive smile. "Something like that." Serena narrowed her eyes but said nothing. The next day, she tried his advice, called Baxter Dairy. Within minutes, they offered her a rate lower than what she'd been paying for years. That was the first time in months she felt a glimmer of relief. After that, Felix's quiet influence grew impossible to ignore. He reorganized the storage room in a single afternoon, labeling everything from coffee filters to sugar packets. "Efficiency saves energy," he said, when she raised an eyebrow. He adjusted the brewing schedule to match peak hours, ensuring every customer's coffee was fresh, and that none went to waste. Then one Monday morning, he suggested something bold. "You should switch to table service for weekday mornings," he said, while wiping down the counter. Serena frowned.
"That's ridiculous."
"We don't have enough staff." "You don't need more staff," Felix replied, tone calm and analytical. "Just a better flow. I've watched the rush hour pattern. People come in, wait too long at the register, and leave frustrated. If you take orders at the table, even for just an hour, you'll increase sales." She wanted to dismiss it, but something in his confidence stopped her. He wasn't guessing. He knew. "Try it for a week," he added, sensing her hesitation. "If it doesn't work, I'll clean the bathrooms for a month without complaint." She laughed at that, the first real laugh she'd shared with him since he started. "You've got yourself a deal." By Friday, sales were up nearly 20%. The regulars loved the change. Customers stayed longer, ordered more, and for the first time since she opened, Serena had to extend her bakery orders. She tried to thank him, but he just waved it off. "It's not me."
"It's your coffee. I just—"
Cleared the path for it. But Serena couldn't ignore what she'd seen. The precision in his calculations, the calm authority in his voice when he talked about operations, and the effortless way he handled problems that used to keep her awake at night. Felix wasn't just a dishwasher. One afternoon, as they sat together after closing, Serena finally asked the question that had been haunting her for weeks. "You've done this before, haven't you?"
"Run a business."
Felix looked up from the cup he was drying. His expression was unreadable.
"Something like that?" "That's not an answer." He smiled faintly, eyes softening. "I've seen things, learned things."
"Maybe I just wanted to see if they worked in real life." She studied him, the lines on his hands, the way he avoided her gaze when he lied. He was carrying something heavy, she could feel it, something that didn't belong to the man she saw scrubbing floors. But she didn't push further. She'd learned that some people only speak when they're ready. Over the next few weeks, the cafe continued to thrive. Second Cup had become a small miracle, filled with the scent of roasted beans and the sound of second chances. The students who came to study stayed longer. The older man who used to sit alone by the window now chatted with strangers. Even Serena found herself humming as she worked, her movements lighter, her smiles more frequent. And Felix, he seemed to find peace in the rhythm of it all. He moved through the cafe with quiet purpose, sleeves rolled up, hair falling over his forehead, occasionally glancing up at Serena to ask if she needed anything. Sometimes their eyes met. just for a second, and the air between them shifted, softer somehow. One night, as she was closing the register, Serena looked at the numbers glowing on the screen. For the first time in years, Second Cup wasn't just surviving, it was growing. She turned to where Felix was sweeping the floor. "You did this," she said quietly. He stopped, leaning on the broom handle, his expression unreadable. "No, you did," but she could see it, the way he'd transformed her small, struggling cafe with invisible hands. The way he saw what others missed. The way he fit here, like he was meant to rebuild something. Maybe not just the cafe, but himself too. That night, when the lights went out and the city's hum faded into the distance, Serena sat alone at the counter, tracing her finger around the rim of her empty mug. "Who are you really, Felix?" she whispered into the quiet. Outside, the rain had begun to fall again, gentle, rhythmic, like an echo of the morning he first walked through her door. The rain that night was steady, a soft percussion against the windows of Second Cup. Most of the lights were off except for the faint golden glow spilling from the counter. Serena stood near the espresso machine, cleaning the filters and arranging cups for the next morning. When she turned around, she noticed Felix by the front door. He wasn't moving, just standing there, one hand on the glass, the other buried deep in his coat pocket. The streetlight outside cast a pale beam through the rain, slicing his silhouette in gold and grey. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. Felix didn't answer right away. He seemed to be watching something only he could see. Or maybe he was just lost inside himself. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "I used to think success meant having everything."
Until I realized I'd lost myself, Serena froze.
The sound of the rain filled the silence between them. It was the first time Felix had spoken of himself. Really spoken. Not just small talk about beans or pastries, but something real, something that weighed heavy. She didn't ask him to explain. She could see enough in the way his shoulders tensed, in the faint shadow that crossed his eyes. The kind of shadow that came from regret, not fatigue. For a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the old wall clock and the soft gurgle of water running down the window pane. Then Serena stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe this is your second cup too," Felix turned to her then. And for the first time since he walked into her cafe, he smiled. Not the polite, distant one she'd seen before, but something raw, real, almost boyish. It softened the edges of his face, and for a heartbeat, Serena felt warmth bloom in her chest. He let out a small laugh, shaking his head slightly. "You really believe in second chances, don't you?"
"I have to," she said, her tone light but sincere.
"Otherwise, this place wouldn't exist." They didn't speak after that. Felix stepped forward, taking the cloth from her hand to help wipe the counter. Their fingers brushed, brief and electric, but neither pulled away. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was full of things neither could say aloud. After a while, the storm softened, turning into a quiet drizzle. Felix moved around the cafe, checking that the chairs were stacked properly, adjusting a vase that leaned too far left. Serena watched him, her thoughts tangled somewhere between curiosity and comfort. There was something peaceful about him tonight, as if the confession had unburdened him a little. He didn't hide behind that polite reserve anymore. For the first time, he seemed present. When he passed by the window again, Serena noticed the reflection of the two of them, side by side, in that small corner cafe, and felt an unfamiliar stillness settle inside her. For months, Second Cup had been her refuge, her rebuild, her way of surviving after everything fell apart. She'd poured herself into the coffee, the people, the daily rhythm of serving and cleaning, of smiling and pretending she was fine. But tonight, standing beside Felix, she realized something. It wasn't just her place anymore. Felix belonged to this rhythm too. The clink of cups, the the hiss of steam, the faint hum of jazz from the old speaker in the corner. When he finally spoke again, his tone was lighter. "You ever notice how quiet the world feels when it rains?" "Yes," she said.
"It's like the noise finally stops pretending," he chuckled. A low, genuine sound. I would have leaned against the counter,
Watching her with a look that was equal parts admiration and something gentler, more personal. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. Inside, time seemed to stretch. The air was thick with the smell of roasted beans and something sweet. Maybe vanilla, maybe hope. Serena moved to pour the last bit of leftover brew into 2 cups. "It's not fresh," she warned, "but it's warm." He accepted the cup, their fingers brushing again. "Warm's good enough." They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, sipping in silence. Through the window, the city shimmered, reflections of streetlights rippling through puddles, taxis gliding past like ghosts. Neither of them said what they were really thinking, that maybe, after too many wrong turns, they had stumbled into a small corner of the world that finally felt right. When Serena glanced sideways, Felix was looking at her, not intensely, but with quiet gratitude.
as if to say thank you without words. She didn't look away. Instead,
She raised her cup slightly, a faint smile tugging at her lips.
"To second chances," she said. He mirrored her gesture, clinking his cup softly against hers.
"Second cups," he replied. The clink of ceramic was soft, almost tender, a fragile sound that carried something unspoken. From that night on, they didn't need to talk much. Each morning, when the cafe opened, Felix was already there, sleeves rolled up, ready to work beside her. They would share quiet moments, brewing coffee, wiping tables, exchanging small glances that meant more than words ever could. Sometimes, when the first light of dawn slipped through the windows, Serena would catch his reflection beside hers in the glass and think, maybe this is what healing looks like. The world outside still moved too fast, too loud, but inside Second Cup there was warmth, not just from the coffee, but from something slowly, silently growing between them. And for now, that was enough. By early autumn, Second Cup had become something of a quiet miracle. What used to be a sleepy corner cafe was now alive with warmth and chatter. Students bent over laptops, writers nursing their 4th cup, couples sharing a croissant, and secrets under soft amber lights. And in the center of it all were Serena and Felix. They moved together with the rhythm of the place, unspoken, instinctive. She knew when he was about to grind the next batch of beans. He could sense when she needed help before she even asked. Their gestures flowed like choreography, familiar, effortless, beautifully timed. Customers noticed. "Look at them," an old man whispered to his wife one morning. The coffee couple, the nickname stuck. The coffee couple. It made Serena laugh every time she heard it, but deep down, the words stirred something warmer, something she didn't dare name. Even the air seemed to hum differently when Felix was around. He had a quiet charm that slipped beneath the noise. He never flirted, never pushed, but there was something about the way he looked at her, steady, thoughtful, that made Serena's pulse skip without warning. One Saturday evening, after the last customer left and the chairs were turned upside down on the tables, Serena began wiping down the counter. The rain outside had stopped hours ago, leaving the city streets gleaming under the soft orange streetlights. Felix was locking up the back door. The air smelled faintly of espresso and cinnamon, the scent of closing time. When she reached for the light switch, his hand brushed hers. Just a light touch, skin on skin, but it felt like the world stopped breathing. Serena froze. Her fingers hovered over the switch. Felix's hand remained there for a moment longer than necessary. The air between them thickened, charged with something fragile and electric. He drew in a breath, the faintest tremor in his voice.
Serena?
Her name on his lips sounded different, softer, heavier, as though he'd been holding it for too long. She turned to him, heart suddenly pounding, searching his eyes for what he couldn't say. For a fleeting second, he looked as if he might step closer. But then just as suddenly he pulled back, the mask slipping back into place.
Sorry, he murmured, looking away.
Didn't mean to. She shook her head quickly. It's fine. It wasn't fine. The air still crackled between them. She turned the lights off, and for a moment, they stood together in the dim glow spilling through the windows. Two silhouettes framed by the city's soft heartbeat. Felix lingered, as if torn between leaving and saying something he shouldn't. His jaw tightened. His hands clenched briefly at his sides. Then he exhaled, a sound halfway between frustration and resignation. Good night, Serena. Good night, Felix. He left, and the bell over the door chimed softly behind him. Serena stood there long after the echo faded. The cafe felt suddenly too quiet, too still. She pressed her palm to her chest, trying to calm the flutter that refused to settle. Something about the look in his eyes haunted her, like a secret pressing against the walls of his heart. She thought back to that night weeks ago, when he'd said he'd lost himself chasing success. She hadn't asked then what he meant, and she didn't ask now, because some part of her, the fragile part still learning to trust again, was afraid of the answer. The next morning, nothing was said. Felix arrived early, as usual, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly damp from the morning mist. He smiled, the same gentle, careful smile. Serena returned it, pretending nothing had happened. They moved around each other like always. She brewed, he wiped, she poured, he served. But beneath the familiar rhythm, something had shifted. Every brush of the hand, every shared glance seemed heavier now, charged with the memory of that near confession. That night replayed itself in Serena's mind again and again, the way he'd looked at her, the hesitation in his voice, the warmth in that single touch. But what unsettled her most wasn't the touch. It was the restraint. Whatever he was holding back, it wasn't indifference. It was something deeper, something that scared him enough to stay silent. One afternoon, as they reorganized the shelves behind the counter, she caught him lost in thought, staring at the row of mugs as though they were miles away. "You okay?" she asked softly. He blinked, the spell breaking.
Yeah, just
"Thinking about coffee?" she teased. He smiled faintly.
something like that. That phrase again.
Something like that. She'd heard it before, the same way he'd once brushed off her question about his past. Every time he said it, she felt him slipping behind a wall she couldn't climb. But Serena didn't press. She couldn't, because she knew what it was like to live behind walls, to rebuild yourself brick by brick, afraid someone might look too closely and see what was broken underneath. And so she gave him the same grace she once needed, space and silence. When closing time came again, they worked side by side in quiet harmony. She brewed one last pot of coffee. He mopped the floor, humming softly to himself. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, the soft hiss of steam filled the silence between them. Familiar, comforting, and a little bit sad. As she turned off the final light, Felix looked at her, as if wanting to say something, to break the quiet once and for all. But then he simply nodded and whispered, "See you tomorrow." And Serena nodded back, even though her heart whispered something different. "I wish tomorrow could tell me who you really are." The lunch rush had hit its peak. Plates clinked, steam hissed, and the scent of roasted beans hung thick in the air. Second cup was alive. Laughter, chatter, and the low hum of espresso machines weaving into a comforting symphony. Serena moved behind the counter with practiced grace, her apron dusted with flour, her cheeks warm from the heat and the joy of watching her cafe thrive. Felix stood by the register, smiling faintly as he handed a cappuccino to a young couple. For the first time in years, there was light in his eyes, a kind of calm that only comes when you finally stop running. Then the bell above the door rang. A gust of cold air swept through, followed by a woman in a tailored beige coat and pearl earrings. She looked wildly out of place among the cozy crowd, sharp, composed, the kind of presence that made people step aside without knowing why. Her gaze scanned the room once, then locked onto Felix for a split second. Serena thought the woman must have mistaken him for someone else, but the way Felix's face drained of color told her otherwise. "Is Mr. Felix Walker here?" The woman's voice cut through the noise like glass shattering. The cafe fell silent.
Even the espresso machine hissed to a stop. A customer dropped a spoon.
Somewhere in the back, a mug clattered to the floor. Serena blinked, her heart suddenly pounding. "Walker?" The woman took a step forward, eyes fixed on Felix. "The missing heir of Walker Foods," she said, her tone somewhere between relief and disbelief. "We've been looking for you for over a year." Every pair of eyes in the cafe turned to Felix. Serena felt the world tilt. Her breath caught in her throat. Felix didn't move.
His expression was blank, too still, too quiet. "Felix,"
she whispered.
"what is she talking about?"
He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hand tightened around the counter's edge, knuckles white. The woman continued, oblivious to the tremor spreading through the room. "Your family's company is falling apart, Felix. They need you to come back."
"Your father—" "Stop," Felix said, voice low, strained. The woman froze, but Serena was already stepping closer, her pulse echoing in her ears. "Is it true?"
she asked softly.
"Are you him?"
Felix looked at her, then really looked, and the sorrow in his eyes was answer enough. She took a step back, shaking her head. "All this time, you worked here, washed dishes, fixed lights, made coffee. Was this all just a game to you?" Her voice cracked at the end. The room felt suddenly too small, too bright. Felix's lips parted, his breath catching, as though the words he needed were trapped inside his chest.
"Serena, it wasn't," but he stopped.
Because there was no defense that wouldn't sound like a lie. He looked around the cafe, at the customers who had laughed with him, at the counter he'd polished 1,000 times, at the small corner of the world that had finally made him feel human again. Then he unfastened his apron. The motion was slow, deliberate. He folded it once, set it gently on the counter beside a steaming cup of coffee, the one he had just made for Serena. The coffee still trembled slightly, the ripples catching the reflection of the rain beginning to fall outside. Without another word, Felix turned toward the door. "Felix!" Serena called out, but her voice was barely more than a whisper. He paused for a moment, shoulders rising and falling as if he were gathering the strength to look back. But he didn't. He just stepped outside, into the grey drizzle that had started to soak the street. The door closed softly behind him. For a moment, no one in the cafe moved. Then the woman, be whoever she was, exhaled shakily, muttered something about contacting the family, and left. The bell chimed again, faint and hollow. Serena stood frozen behind the counter, staring at the abandoned apron, the faint trace of his warmth still lingering in the air. The coffee he'd left for her was still steaming. Tiny spirals of vapor curled upward, fading into nothing. She wrapped her hands around the cup, though it burned. Her vision blurred. The scent, his blend, always a touch more bitter than sweet, filled her lungs until it hurt to breathe. Outside, the rain thickened. Drops streaked down the window, distorting the view of the street where Felix had disappeared. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this wasn't just a lie about a name. It was a lie about trust, about the fragile, unspoken hope she'd begun to let herself feel again. Her reflection in the glass looked foreign. The same woman who'd once lost everything because she believed in the wrong man. And now, once again, she had believed. The bell above the door jingled as the last customer slipped quietly out, leaving Serena alone with the sound of the rain. She sank onto a stool,
hands still wrapped around the now lukewarm cup,
staring into the dark surface that no longer reflected anything but loss. And somewhere out there, she knew Felix Walker, the man she thought she knew, was walking through the rain, carrying a truth he could no longer hide. The morning after Felix left, Second Cup felt different. It wasn't the empty seat behind the counter or the missing laughter during the morning rush. It was something deeper, quieter. The air itself seemed thinner, as though every sound had been swallowed by silence. Serena still opened the cafe at 6 a.m. sharp. She still ground the beans, steamed the milk, wiped the same counter they used to share. But no matter how carefully she measured the coffee, it always came out wrong. Too bitter, too thin, too empty, customers noticed too.
"Everything okay, Serena?"
An old regular asked one morning, stirring his cup.
"Coffee tastes different lately." She forced a smile.
Just trying a new blend, but it wasn't the beans. It was the missing heartbeat behind the counter. The one who used to adjust the light just so, who would hum softly when the morning sun hit the window, who made even silence feel like company. The headlines came 3 days later. Billionaire heir found living as dishwasher in Boston cafe. Felix Walker, missing for 18 months, discovered under new identity. The story spread like wildfire. From business columns to gossip blogs, even talk shows debated whether his working-class experiment was genuine or a stunt. Serena stopped opening her phone after the second day. Every article felt like a blade twisting deeper. They all spoke about him like an idea, a symbol, not the man she'd come to know. Felix Walker. Heir, scandal, mystery. Not Felix, the quiet man who used to mop the floor with sleeves rolled up. Not the one who stayed late to fix a broken lamp, or who whispered that second chances tasted like cinnamon. The media turned him into something else. Something untouchable, and in doing so, they erased the man she'd fallen for. Days turned into weeks. Second Cup kept running, but it no longer lived. The laughter faded, replaced by the mechanical clinks of cups and spoons. Even the regulars spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the ghost that lingered there. Serena started working later at night, not because she had to, but because she didn't know what to do with the quiet when the doors closed. One evening, the rain returned, the same kind of cold drizzle that had once brought Felix into her cafe. The lights flickered against the wet windows, reflecting her tired face as she sat at the counter, flipping through the ledger. She wasn't really looking for numbers. She was looking for distraction. Something to fill the ache. The pages were smudged with coffee stains, ink blots, little notes she and Felix had scribbled together. Need more cream? Try new supplier? Remember to fix the back light. Her fingers paused near the back of the book, where a loose page seemed tucked between the sheets. She pulled it out. The handwriting was familiar, neat, strong, but with a slant that carried warmth. You gave me more peace than my entire fortune ever did. The sentence was simple, and yet it broke something inside her. Serena stared at the words, her vision blurring. Her thumb traced the ink as though touching the shape of his voice. He must have written it the day he left. Maybe even that morning, while she was still sleeping upstairs, unaware that his world and hers were about to shatter. Her breath hitched. The paper trembled in her hand. A single tear fell, darkening the spot just beneath the word peace. She pressed her palm flat against it, as if she could hold the memory in place, as if she could keep it from fading like everything else. Outside, the rain grew heavier, tapping against the glass in soft, relentless rhythm. The cafe lights glowed dimly, throwing shadows across the wooden floor where Felix used to stand. Serena closed the ledger slowly, her hands trembling. The room around her blurred at the edges. She set the book down, resting her head on her arms. For the first time in months, she let herself cry. Not the quiet tears of exhaustion, but the kind that come when you finally stop pretending you're fine. And as the sobs came, the cafe filled with a sound she hadn't heard since the night he left. The steady drip of coffee brewing. Only this time, she hadn't turned the machine on. The air smelled faintly of roasted beans, warm and bitter.
A ghost of his presence, maybe.
Or maybe just her mind trying to hold on to the one thing that ever made sense. She whispered into the empty room, voice breaking. "Why did you have to go, Felix?"
No answer, just the quiet hum of the rain. For a long time.
She sat there, listening, remembering, breathing through the ache, and though she didn't know it yet, that sentence he left behind, that one fragile line in her ledger, would be the thing that gave her courage to seek him again. Because for the first time, she realized he hadn't left to escape her. He had left because he believed he no longer deserved her. Serena lifted her head, wiped her tears, and whispered to the dark, "Then maybe it's my turn to find you." The rain outside softened, as though the night itself was listening. She turned off the lights, locked the door, and stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the faint scent of coffee wrap around her like a promise. Tomorrow she would start again, but this time not to forget, to find him. The night was still, the city half asleep under a veil of mist. Serena sat alone in the quiet cafe, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound that remained. Her fingers brushed over the note Felix had left behind. The ink slightly smudged, as if written in haste or with trembling hands. "You gave me more peace than my entire fortune ever did." She traced the words with her thumb. For the first time, she saw beyond the mystery, beyond the silence he had built around himself. Felix hadn't lied, not really. He had only hidden the weight of a name that had stolen his freedom, his identity, his joy. All he wanted was to start over, just like she had. Serena rose from her chair and walked toward the counter. The espresso machine gleamed faintly under the dim lights. She filled the portafilter, tamped the coffee gently, the way he'd taught her. Not too tight, not too loose. The familiar hiss of steam filled the room, and for a moment she could almost hear his quiet laughter again. When the aroma bloomed, rich and bittersweet, she smiled through her tears. "Maybe this time," she whispered, "it's my turn to show up." She placed the cup on the counter and watched the steam curl upward, a silent promise, a signal to the man who had taught her that peace could be brewed, one careful cup at a time. Outside, rain had stopped. The streets glistened under the streetlights, and the world felt clean again, like something waiting to begin. Serena walked upstairs to her small apartment above the cafe. She opened the drawer where she kept her savings, the envelope stuffed with tip money, and what little profit the cafe made. It wasn't much, but it was enough.
Enough for gas.
Enough for a journey. She pulled out an old postcard, one Felix had left behind months ago, a photograph of Maine's rocky coast, the sea stretching endlessly into the horizon. On the back, in small, careful handwriting, were the words, "If I ever disappear again, you'll probably find me here, between the wind and the sea." Serena folded the postcard and slipped it into her pocket. Then she turned off the lights one by one. The cafe, their cafe, stood dark and silent, save for the faint, lingering scent of roasted beans and cinnamon. She paused by the door, running her hand over the worn wood, her heart heavy but steady. "See you soon," she murmured, locking it behind her. Outside, her car waited under a flickering street lamp. She tossed her duffel bag into the passenger seat, started the engine, and let the radio hum softly in the background. The road stretched ahead, slick with rain and promise. As she drove through the sleeping city, memories flickered like passing headlights. The first day Felix walked in, the first morning they brewed together, the first time he smiled for real, and then his words echoed again in her mind. "Success isn't everything. Sometimes it's what you lose that shows you who you are." The highway opened wide before her, the sky beginning to pale at the edges with the hint of dawn. Serena gripped the steering wheel tighter. She didn't know what she would find in Maine, forgiveness, a second chance, or just closure. But she knew she had to go. Because somewhere between the scent of coffee and the sound of rain, Felix had become her peace too. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to share another cup. The road ended where the sea began. Maine stretched before her, grey cliffs, endless wind, and the rhythmic crash of waves against rock. Serena parked the car by a dirt path, the ocean mist brushing against her skin like a whisper. In the distance, a small wooden cabin stood at the edge of the bluff, half hidden by pine trees and sea fog. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. She hesitated before stepping out, heart pounding in her chest. Every step toward that cabin felt heavier, not from fear, but from everything she hadn't said. When she reached the porch, she saw him through the window. Felix was sitting by the table, a mug in his hands, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the horizon. His hair was longer, his jaw rough with days of unshaven silence. But the stillness in him, that same quiet grace, hadn't changed. Serena raised her hand, knocked gently. Once. Twice. Felix turned. His eyes widened, not with surprise, but with something softer, almost disbelief. He opened the door slowly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind filled the silence for them, carrying the scent of salt and pine between two people who had forgotten how to begin. "Serena," he finally said, her name falling from his lips like an exhale he'd been holding too long. She swallowed, forcing a small smile. "You weren't that hard to find," he almost smiled back. Almost. "I didn't think you'd come. I didn't think I would either." A pause lingered, heavy but not cold. She glanced past him. Inside, the cabin was simple. Books piled in corners, a small stove, and a coffee pot on the counter. Her eyes lingered there. "You still make it every morning?" He nodded. "Can't quite quit the habit." She stepped inside and the door closed softly behind her. The floor creaked beneath her shoes and she could hear the wind breathing against the windows. Felix reached for another cup, poured the dark coffee, and slid it toward her. It smelled just like second cup, strong, warm, familiar. She took a sip. The bitterness curled on her tongue, but there was comfort in it too. "This is still the blend I made," she said quietly. "I never changed it." Something fragile shifted between them. The ocean roared outside, and yet, inside that tiny cabin, it felt like the world had stopped, waiting for them to say what truly mattered. "I read your note," she said at last. "You didn't have to disappear like that." "I did," he replied, eyes on his mug. "If I stayed, I would have turned everything you built into something about me."
About my name.
"That cafe was your sanctuary, Serena."
"I couldn't take that from you." She set her cup down.
"But you were part of it." He looked up then, and for the first time his gaze didn't hide. There was guilt there, yes, but also a deep, aching tenderness.
"I didn't deserve to be." "Maybe not back then," she said softly.
"But you do now." The wind rattled the window panes. Somewhere outside a gull cried. Serena moved closer, enough to see the flecks of amber in his tired eyes. "I lost everything once," she whispered. My name, my dream, my trust. But that cafe, it wasn't about rebuilding a career. It was about finding people who'd lost their way.
and giving them a second cup.
You were one of them, Felix. His throat worked, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. And you were mine. The words hung between them, unguarded and true. For a long moment, they just sat. Two people surrounded by silence, but no longer alone in it. The wind howled outside, the kettle began to whistle softly, and the smell of coffee filled the room again. Serena smiled faintly. You know, she murmured, the world keeps spinning out there, but somehow it feels like everything that matters is right here. Felix's eyes softened. Then maybe we should stay here a little longer. Morning came quietly, wrapped in fog and the low hum of the ocean. The first light brushed against the windows of the cabin, soft and silver, touching everything it found. The coffee pot, the half-empty mugs, the two people who hadn't slept much, but somehow felt at peace for the first time in months. Serena stirred awake on the worn couch, a blanket draped over her shoulders. The smell of freshly ground beans lingered in the air. She turned to see Felix at the counter, sleeves rolled up, carefully pouring hot water into a small dripper. "You're up early," she murmured, voice still husky from sleep. He glanced back with a faint smile. Old habits. The sea wakes me up before the sun does. She rose and joined him by the counter. Steam swirled between them, glowing in the morning light. Felix handed her a mug, the same chipped one she had used the night before. "This place suits you," she said softly. "It's quiet, peaceful." He nodded, eyes tracing the horizon through the window. "It took me a long time to understand what peace really meant." Serena tilted her head.
"And what does it mean now?"
He paused, the kind of pause that carried the weight of a lifetime. "When I left Walker Foods, I thought I was running away. From my family, the press, the endless boardrooms. But I wasn't running from something. I was running towards something I hadn't found yet." Her gaze softened.
"And did you find it?"
He turned to her, the faintest smile curving his lips. "I did. The day I walked into your cafe," Serena felt a lump rise in her throat. "Felix!" He set his mug down and leaned against the counter. "You know, my father built that company from nothing. He thought legacy was measured by the number of zeros in a contract. I believed him, until I realized that I was living a life that wasn't mine." His voice lowered. At second cup, I wasn't an heir or a headline.
"I was just a man trying to make something right." The words hung in the air like steam rising between them. Simple, honest, and raw. Serena took a step closer. "You don't have to explain," she said.
"You already did the hardest part. You let yourself start over." He looked at her, eyes shining faintly in the morning light.
"And you?"
"Did you ever forgive me?" She smiled, not wide but warm. "I think I did the moment I read your note." They stood in silence again, but it wasn't heavy anymore. Outside, the waves broke gently against the shore, and the fog began to lift, revealing streaks of sunlight across the sea. Felix reached for the kettle, refilled her cup. "To second chances?" he said quietly. Serena lifted her mug, meeting his gaze. To second cups. They clinked mugs, the sound soft but clear, and drank. The coffee was rich, smooth, perfectly balanced. No bitterness, only warmth that lingered. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent that once filled her cafe every morning. When she opened them again, Felix was watching her, not with guilt or hesitation, but with a quiet steadiness that felt like home. "I've been thinking," he said. "Walker Foods doesn't need another heir, but maybe it needs a new purpose. Something that actually gives back." Her eyes lit up slightly. "You mean," he nodded, "a new brand, small batch, honest, community-driven."
"We could start with the cafe, rebuild second cup together." The idea made her heart flutter. Not because of business, but because of hope. "Together," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, and this time It reached his eyes.
Together. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and roasted beans. The sun broke through fully now, golden light spilling across the cabin, the sea, and two souls who had found their way back. Not to what they'd lost, but to what they'd been searching for all along. Serena set her cup down, walked toward the open door, and looked out at the glimmering horizon. "You know," she said, half turning, "maybe this really is our second cup." Felix stepped beside her, the corners of his mouth lifting in quiet agreement. "And this time," he said, "we won't let it grow cold." They stood there, side by side, as the tide rolled in. The sun rose higher, and the scent of coffee mingled with the salt air. Somewhere, in that gentle silence, a new beginning brewed.